Good morning, everyone. Welcome to LinkedIn Live, where your living room becomes a TV studio. My name is Brian Burkhart, and there is nothing about today that is about me. It's about our very special guest, the author of The Hug of War, Cathy Carroll. Cathy, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Brian. I'm doing great. Thank you
I'm
so much for doing this.
Oh no, I'm super excited to speak with you about your new book. We have a lot to cover in a relatively short amount of time.
We
And
do.
so what I want to do is one, be a good steward of the clock, but really give people a chance to know what your book, Hug of War, is all about. So let's put some pleasantries aside and get into this. Yes?
Let's do it.
All right, cool. I think your story is fascinating, by the way. I think it's important to remember that you, of course, are an entrepreneur yourself with your company Legacy Onward, but as a coach, as clearly a very bright person with amazing degrees and tons of experience doing all kinds of cool things, you seemed like the perfect person to write this book about family business. It's in many ways all you ever knew. It's what you grew up with from your grandfather to your father, and then obviously to you. Tell us, if you will, just to kick us off here, what was the genesis of writing your book? What was the stuff that was inside you that said, you know what? I've got to put pen to paper here.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. As many of you know, and thank you all who are joining, this is just a really special moment for me to be with you all. So many of you know that I grew up in a family business. As Brian said, my grandfather was the original entrepreneur in our family. And then I ran my father's business. And comparing the experience of running my father's business after 20 years of corporate leadership, it felt very, very different. And it was very hard for me to put my finger on what was so different, but it felt like I was operating in a twilight zone sometimes. And so after 3 years, I stepped away from my father's business, and I thought quite a bit about what just happened. And I couldn't answer the question. And I thought, you know what, if I interview a bunch of other leaders, maybe I'll get a clue as to what makes this leadership in a family business so different. And so I was very fortunate to have found over 70 different leaders to interview. And I gathered an enormous amount of data, and I started clustering it around. And then I started to look at what are the themes that are consistent with my experience, and then what are the themes that I'm learning from these other leaders. And eventually it all started to come together. And so this book has been a 10-year project in the making, and it took 10 years for all the insights to percolate. Like, I just needed to sit with this stuff for a while and for the insights to emerge in whatever organic and natural way that they did. And I have a much better understanding of what made it so uniquely challenging and also uniquely rewarding in its own way. So yeah, that was really the genesis. And thinking and writing is thinking. I learned that. Like, I didn't in the process of writing the book is partly how I discovered what I was learning. It was an interesting process.
It makes perfect sense, one that I understand. And I'll tell you, as I read your book, devoured is a better word. I thought of my own situation. Sidebar that you and I have discussed in the past is
Yeah.
I had to fire my father. That's one of those kind of family business things that you really hope can be avoided. It was brutal. We're good today, but it really made me think of, in many ways, one of the things that you wrote, page 80, chapter 6, conflict is unavoidable. I
Yeah.
thought, whoa, I thought we would be able to avoid such things. We are DNA pairs here. Tell me a little bit more why you believe that in family businesses, or maybe business in general, it could be both. Why do
Yeah.
you think conflict is unavoidable?
I think in any intimate relationship, whether you're in a family business or in a family or in a marriage or any really close relationship, there is going to be conflict. There are different ways that people see the world, and it's natural for conflict to exist. What I think is really hard is conflict is an unpleasant experience. People don't enjoy conflict. And so many of us try to avoid conflict. Some are comfortable with it, some actually seek conflict, but so many of us
Come
try to
on, let's fight. No.
yeah. So many of us try to avoid conflict. And one of the reasons why I think it's really important to engage in constructive conflict in a family business is because that's how you get the best ideas. When you bring different perspectives to business decisions, it's really helpful to hash out the details of what what's the right path going forward? And different people can bring different perspectives to the same challenge. I'm actually going to credit Adam Grant in his book Think Again for drawing the distinction between task conflict and relationship conflict. And his research showed that task conflict is actually incredibly valuable. You get much better outcomes much faster when you engage in robust task conflict. So if people can reframe their thinking about conflict, and instead of avoiding it at all costs, but actually saying, you know what, this is one of those situations where we should engage in some really robust, healthy task conflict in order to get the best idea. What's then challenging is task conflict can quickly devolve to relationship conflict. And Adam Grant's research showed that relationship conflict is actually quite destructive, doesn't yield the best outcomes, certainly doesn't yield them fast.
Oh,
And
all the feels, right? It just gets in the way of things sometimes.
yeah, we just spend our time defending our egos instead of actually engaging in the real robust issues. So I talk about in that chapter, not only please go engage in task conflict, and here are some resources to do it, and do your best to mitigate relationship conflict. And there are a bunch of suggestions on how to mitigate it. And when relationship conflict does show up, here's how you can work through it.
Yeah.
The process for working through relationship conflict, because there's no other way past it than through. If you just try to avoid it or suppress it, it just sits there anyway and festers, and then sometimes explodes in surprising ways, which again causes a lot of destruction.
I would have liked your book about a decade and a half ago, just for the record. If I had to truly summarize what Hug of War comes down to in a single word, and you could tell me I'm wrong, you're the author, but from my perspective, it was fairly obvious. It was the notion of polarities.
Mm,
It was very, very consequential to me. The more I read, the more I dug into the things that you thank you for joining us today. The more the things I was reading, it really did hit me hard, and I want to get into this because it really is at the root of so much of what you talk about. And just to give way of example, some polarities. Obviously, think of things like the North and the South Pole. We've got these opposites, in that case, polar opposites. But words like urgent, patient, formal, informal, love, logic, they're clearly connected, but on opposite sides of the spectrum.
mm,
And I believe that in many ways, it's the next portion of that conflict discussion goes into this notion of polarities. Explain this to everyone. Get into the goods here, Kath. This is the stuff. Tell me about polarities.
Very good. So thank you for highlighting some samples of polarities. I think urgent and patient. Let's pick up on that one because that's an easy one to understand. What defines a polarity is when you have two opposing things that define each other. Like a urgent doesn't exist. The concept of urgency does not exist without the concept of patience, right? They define each other like an inhale and an exhale. You don't, inhale doesn't exist without exhale. So when you have a polarity, you end up with a different way to engage with the challenge, because in any polarity, you need both poles to exist. Urgency needs to exist and patience needs to exist. And so too often we bring either or thinking, which is how our brains are wired, how we naturally exist in the world, to challenges that are actually polarities. And a polarity, if you bring either or thinking to a polarity, it's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You really need a different approach to handling a polarity. So, uh, for example, I tend to be a little bit more on the patient side. I tend to be maybe patient to a fault. And other people tend to be really urgent. We need to do, go, go, go.
Are you talking about me? I mean, okay.
That's true, right? You do have a
No, I,
tendency to push
oh my
urgency. Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah, exactly. And the art of leadership is knowing when and how express urgency and when and how to express patience, and knowing that there's value in both, and discerning when to bring each one to the table, and maybe even trying to find a way to do both, which sounds kind of weird in urgency and patience because they are so opposed. It feels like a very strong either or, but there are ways creatively that you can bring both urgency and patience.
Because neither are inherently wrong. They're just
Neither is
different.
inherently wrong. Exactly. Yeah. And so whenever you face a polarity, what was another one that you brought up?
Formal, informal, which I thought was
Formal,
kind of a
informal.
fun
Yeah,
one.
great one. Perfect. So what I invite people to do is to think about what are the benefits of formal, and then what's the overuse of formal? What happens when you're in too much formal? And then what are the benefits of informal? And what's the overuse of informal? And so you kind of map this out on a little quadrant. And then you draw your attention to how do I get the best of this and this? How do I get
Yep.
the best of formal and the best of informal? How do I get the best of urgent and the best of patient without getting stuck in a mindset of I have to do either or? And it
Well,
invites a lot of creative thinking.
let's get into tactics in just a sec, but I think it's super important that we remember at the heart of it what you wrote about so brilliantly in your book. This is a line that I honestly, when I was getting ready to do our discussion today, it was like, oh, here it is. It was almost as if the page opened and beams of gold radiated out. You wrote, the right question is, how do we navigate the inherent tension that exists between the family and the business so that we get the best for both the family and the business? That's what hug of war is all about. That's what polarities teaches us. It's this notion of both and finding some way to get the right stuff for the family and the right stuff for the business. I have a hunch that in your current practice and all the clients that you see, you've come across red flags, best practices, all the things. Give me a couple of the red flags. What are the things you see when you go, oh, this is a problem where the family and the business are actually at odds, not in sync?
Yeah. First, I want to thank you very much for teeing that up so beautifully. I want to highlight a little bit more this distinction between the family and the business, because the thesis of the hug of war, which you outlined pretty well, is that there are rules of engagement, or what I call mindsets related to the business, and there are rules of engagement or a certain mindset related to the family. And I want to just elaborate a little bit more on that before
Please.
I highlight some red flags. So, the rules of engagement for the business are, for example, profits,
Yeah.
competition, meritocracy. We earn our roles, right? The rules of engagement for the family, or the family mindset, is about fairness and sharing and unconditional belonging. And so you have these opposing mindsets that are in constant tension with each other. And it creates not only dissonance in the leader's head, like which one do I do? I don't know. Like if I'm obeying the business rules, we should do X, Y, and Z. If I'm obeying the family rules, we need to do A, B, and C. Those are totally in opposition more often than not. Um, and so that's like the fundamental challenge, and what makes the leadership challenge so unique in a family business. So I'll give you an example of a really common manifestation of this tension. And it's in a really simple example, but how do I pay my children? Like, how am I going to compensate family members in the family business?
I mean, really well sounds good.
Yeah, I think that sounds really good.
At the
And it's
highest
funny you
level
say
possible.
that. Yeah, in my research, it seems that family business people either tend to overpay or underpay themselves.
Yeah.
Very few are actually in the Goldilocks zone of sort of the market wage. And there's justifiable reasons on both sides for why one would do that. But let's just stick with this concept. How much should I pay my children or all the family members who are working in the business? If you use the business mindset, it's a very clear right answer. You pay people for the job that they do. You pay a market wage for their work, right? But a lot of family businesses actually pay everyone the same amount. And if you think about it from the family mindset, it can make a lot of sense.
Sure.
For example, all right, I've got 3 children in this family business. I really love them all. I don't want to create competition among my siblings. You know what? I don't want them to think I love one more than the other. I'm just going to pay them all the same. That'll be easier. We won't get into conflict. Everything will be fine. And that actually is problematic in the long run because it eventually leads to resentment on both sides of the
Yep.
equation.
There's probably a one of the three that works harder or more than the others, and that resentment will build clearly from the other two. Makes
That
perfect sense.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And so I invite people to think creatively about, all right, well, what's the value of this equal compensation? What do you want to get out of equal? And then what do you want to get out of market wage or, the business mindset? And then how can you think creatively about compensating your family members in a way that gets some of the best of equal and some of the best of market? And it creates a lot of really interesting creative thinking, which is different. It's not how we're used to operating, right? We're used to thinking it's either or, but this way of thinking is bringing the appropriate tool to the appropriate challenge.
That is truly a great example of the tension between a business and how to run it most efficiently, effectively, profitably, etc., and that notion of family and love. It's the hug of war. The title, quite brilliant. I'm so intrigued by all the things that you've done. Let's go back to my question about the red flags. It sometimes seems easier to see problems than successes. In your consultancy, you probably run across these red flags a lot. What do you see sometimes?
What's coming to mind is a client that I'm working with right now. He came to me because he was struggling with decision making.
Mm,
And what we uncovered in the course of several conversations is that he is very judgmental of his father's leadership because his father has a very intuitive style of leadership. His father kind of shoots from the hip and wings it. And the business is in its third generation. The father's the third generation leader. And it's had some ups, it's had some downs. It's sort of, for the most part, muddled through, but it hasn't been a wildly profitable business. And so the son, who grew up watching his dad shoot from the hip and make decisions based on intuition, responded in a way that says, we need data, we need
oh,
analysis. And so his big contribution is to bring analytical thinking to the business, which has been enormously helpful.
kind of a polarity, two different styles of a very,
Exactly.
yeah.
Intuitive and analytical. And what's interesting is that as the father may be in the overuse of intuitive, the son is in the overuse of analytical because he's in indecision. He's in analysis paralysis. He can't get enough data to make the right decision. And he's not willing to make the decision until he has enough data to actually pull the trigger. And so what's that created is a lot of resentment between the two of them.
Mm.
There's a lot of judgment of the other one. There's a lot of inherent anger because there's so much conviction that one person is right and the other one's wrong. Instead of holding it as a polarity and realizing that there's value in analysis and data, and there's value in intuition, and how can they actually leverage each other's strengths to keep themselves in the upsides of both of those instead of falling into the overuses of either one.
And so let me see if I get this right. I'm very intrigued by this. So they're
Mhm.
wildly different styles, the polar opposites of data driven versus that shoot from the hip intuitive style, but it bleeds into a felt sense, a human side of the equation, where we now blur the lines between business and people. And
Mhm.
so dad and son actually are kind of upset at each other versus upset at each other's style. These are two very different things.
That's right. Right.
Okay.
It's a great example of where what could be sort of a task conflict issue has devolved into a relationship conflict issue.
Interesting. Which I think is the perfect and unrehearsed. So kudos to us. Setup for both and.
Yeah.
You cannot read the book Hug of War by Cathy Carroll without understanding polarities and the concept of both and. I thought this was absolutely pure genius. Tell me more.
Well, both and is really the catchphrase for polarity thinking. It's this concept of taking what's the best of this end of the pole, what's the best of this end of the pole, and thinking creatively about how to get both of them to operate together. And it's also focusing on how to mitigate the risk of overusing either one. I mean, that's really at its core. Both and thinking is the way to transcend the indecision in the individual leader, and then the conflict that exists in the family. Because what happens in the family is you end up with some family members strongly attaching to one end of the pole and other family members strongly attaching to the other end of the pole. And what they do is they argue the diagonals. And I'm going to use this as an example. What I
They
mean
dig
by
in.
arguing, yeah, they argue the diagonals because I think the easiest metaphor to understand, especially for those of us who live in the United States, is the liberal and conservative
Yeah.
political environments, right? In Congress, we have the conservatives who vehemently discuss the upsides of conservatism and deride the overuses of liberalism, and then the liberals do the opposite. They celebrate all the great things about liberal ideology and they criticize all the overuses of conservatism, and they don't realize that they're just arguing the diagonals. And when you argue diagonals, you are, and when I say diagonals, it's because I'm using this concept of the polarity map, right?
You have a really beautiful set of models and examples in your book that's kind of a little
Thank you.
quadrant, 4 boxes, and bam, we go
Exactly.
diagonal.
And so what happens is that you're arguing rights. It's right to actually honor the liberal ideology. It is right to honor the upsides of conservative ideology. And so when you do that, you are putting force against force and you're going nowhere. And that's the gridlock that we see in Congress because they're both right. And that's the big challenge in managing these polarities is that you're arguing truths. Both sides are true, right? And so there's no wins
It
to the
is true
argument.
to use data. It is true to use your intuition. They're both right.
Yeah, it's true. It's valuable to be patient. It's valuable to be urgent. It's valuable to honor tradition. It's valuable to innovate. It's valuable to invest in the business. It's valuable to harvest from the business. There are so many polarities, and the ones
Yeah.
that are really unique to family businesses are the ones that are, I mean, the ones we've urgent and patient is a universal leadership challenge, right? But there are some that are actually unique to the family businesses as well. But yeah, that is at its core, it's both and thinking that transcends the dissonance in the leader and then transcends the conflict in the family. Because once the family can hold the polarity as both sides of the polarity are valuable, it changes everything. It changes the conversation. It changes the dynamic. They can engage in actually the task conflict that they need to engage in to have a good path forward.
Let's meet the rubber to the road here because I think this is where it gets real interesting. Um, and I think you did a nice job in your book of giving people real practical wisdom. But let's just use your current example of the father son duo, uh, the data and the off the cuff guys. How do you even begin? Let's say that one of those two, let's use the dad in this relationship. The dad has the information that you've written, understands polarities, understands the notion of both and. What would be a good way for dad to bring it up to the son without creating more conflict, more resentment, more pain and anger? How can we introduce the notion of both and polarities in general into the family business dynamic?
Mhm. Beautiful question, Brian. Thank you for asking. I honestly think that each family has to figure out their own way. If it were in my family, here's how I would do it. I would say to the other person, let's say I'm the father and I'm speaking to my son. I'd say, you know what? I'm really learning to appreciate the value of data and analysis, and I'm so grateful that you bring that skill. Would you be open to spending like 3 days doing some analysis on this project? We're trying to decide how we should bid this project. Can you help us put some data around how we could structure that bid? And at the end of 3 days, we're going to have to make a decision because the bid's due. And so I'd love to sit down with you, understand your analysis as best I can, and then collectively we're going to make a decision and go and put the bid out there. And that might be a way to honor and respect the value that the son brings and also not miss out the opportunity for the father to say, you know what, I think based on the analysis, this is helpful. Here's what my gut says. This is what we're going to do.
That's something you could probably see it on my face. I'm thinking of how that may have gone down in my world a number of years ago. I feel like it might be easier said than done. Probably takes a little bit of practice, but words clearly matter. There's so much that I want to speak to you about, but we are being very quickly, we're running out of time. And so I want to get to some of the last few really great nuggets here. There is something that you write about that I thought was really, really powerful.
Mm,
And it's ever so off from the notion of polarities. But you talked about missed opportunities in family businesses. You say that there is no comfort in the growth zone and there is no growth in the comfort zone.
mm,
And boy, did that hit me
mm,
in a big, big, big way. But I think what you're saying is that to really embrace some of the ideas that you've so beautifully crafted here, that there might be some conflict. It might be uncomfortable. It might be difficult for that father in our example to say, son, I do see the value and wisdom in data. Let's discuss how we could incorporate it better in this RFP process. There's so much there. Tell
mhm.
us a little bit about this notion of the opportunity to really be better, to change, to grow.
Yeah. Well, it's taken me quite a while to learn this the hard way, but whenever I'm facing a setback, whenever I'm in a negative emotion, it's actually a gift for me to look inside myself and figure out what's going on internally within me that doesn't feel right. And that's what I mean. There's no comfort in the growth zone. When I'm growing, when I'm sort of looking inside myself and maturing as a human being, it's really uncomfortable. It's not fun. And when things are really easy and light and joyful and there's no challenge, there's no growth, right? So it's unfortunate that those of us who are who have really grown a lot have faced a lot of setbacks, right? It's sort of part of the game. And so I no longer hold negative setbacks as a bad thing. Now I hold them as an opportunity for me to learn and grow. And that reframe has helped me become a more mature adult, friend, sibling, child, stepmom, wife, and so
All the
on.
things, right?
All the things. I'm definitely a better person as a result of that. And so,
Your
yeah.
success is real. I mean, I just have to honor that in many, 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 many ways, a multitude of ways. But the one thing that you kind of brought it up here, so I'm going to push you just a touch. You say something in your book about what you came to understand about the situation you faced with your father. And I thought it was just absolutely brilliant. Your
Mm,
transparency about your growth
mm.
was very real because how you felt in the moment and how you eventually came to see it were two different things. If you're too uncomfortable, let's not discuss it. But I feel like, tell me a little bit about that growth.
All right. I'll try to make it quick. As I shared earlier, working for my father was a real challenge for me, and it did feel like a big setback. And he and I, if I look back on it now, we're on the opposite end of almost any polar
Every,
you can conceive, right? Um, at the surface level, my dad's a marketing person, and I am a finance and ops person.
you are a math major. That's all
Was
we
a
need to
math
say.
major. Yeah, I spent 6 years as an actuary. I love my math. Um, my father likes to disrupt. I like to stabilize. My father likes to be bold. I like to be humble. And in many ways, much like the father and son I described earlier, it's very, very common for parents and children to be on opposite ends of a polarity, which makes this family business stuff that much harder. And so it took me quite a while and a lot of growth to realize that we were just in the opposites of a polarity. It was just that simple, and not that simple as well. There were other painful things. A lot of my childhood stuff was as alive. All the injuries that I felt as a child were as alive for me as an adult as they were when they took place. And so I didn't bring my best self to the workplace. I brought a ton of baggage, and it took me a long time to grow up and realize that my father did the best he could. I was doing the best I could, and I think in reframing that dynamic, I was able to forgive myself and forgive him for all the perceived and real, hurts along the way. But that just takes a lot of time.
There's an old saying that says the axe quickly forgets, but the tree never does. And it feels very appropriate when you think about the family dynamics in business. If people wanted to buy Hug of War, what would be the best, easiest places, plural, for them to do so?
Any online bookstore. If you go to legacyonward.com slash hug
Your company.
for my company, you'll get links to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and then indie bookstores. And so if you like to support independent booksellers, please go there. If you prefer Barnes and Noble, please go there. Amazon's always available. Actually, around the world now, it's available around the world on Amazon.
Very good. Last question.
Sure.
What's your family think of your book?
Well, what's the expression? You're never a king in your own home, or something along those lines.
You're never a messiah in your own land, something like
Is that
that?
it? Yeah. My family's like, you wrote a book? Wait, what?
Do they want signed copies?
Yeah. No, they're actually very, very happy for me, very proud of me.
Well, I have a signed copy, and I think it's delightful. I think you're delightful. The success that you've achieved is very, very real. I think it's impossible to not know you, to not then feel you. You are so dynamic in so many beautiful ways. I appreciate the book deeply. To me, it's not just a family business book; it's a business book, and I'm going to use so many of the things that you wrote about, polarities, both and chief among them. Closing thoughts, final wisdoms.
um, just so much gratitude to you, Brian, for taking the time to help me with this. I'm
Not at
so
all.
grateful to you. There's no one else I would have imagined to do this. I'd also like to thank Dave and Melissa at Journey 66, Matt Wesley. They've been instrumental in bringing this book to life. And thank you, every single person who joined today.
That
That is what I'm most grateful for. Your warmth and support is incredibly meaningful to me. So thank you for joining today.
hugs.
Hug.
No war.
No,
Hugs.
not today.
Well done. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And I'm sure that you can find Miss Carroll sometime soon. Just keep watching on LinkedIn. Thanks, everyone.